All right. Is that pointing the right way?
I think so.
Oh, that's your phone.
Yeah, I can't get this camera to work. So I made this handy dandy outline of Leviticus, and then I tried to fit everything on one page. So I squished it and got rid of all the margins, and then I squished some other things down into the bottom. So I will pass that around. And who had a chance to look at the video that I sent out last week on Thursday? Oh, great. Most of you all watched it. Okay. So we will, at the end of our time, watch that same video that we sent out last week. That's a brief overview of Leviticus. We are also going to watch the one from Bible Project that goes through this poster. I will pass this out in a minute. Not yet, because I don't want you looking at it yet. So this is Journey Through the Bible. We meet every Thursday for those that are new. And now we're meeting down here, and usually we have a working camera. Except we don't today, so I will try and get that next week. We did this last week. We just talked about how Israel is a place that's in this crossroads between two big empires. It's also in the crossroads from the Mediterranean to the rest of Asia. And so lots of things travel through Israel. It made it a kind of a powerful and well-known nation because of those trade routes. It also was just a conglomerate of other ideologies and other worldviews that all mixed together. And so one of the things when we find when we go through the Bible is it's influenced by a lot of the cultures around it, but it's not scary when it is similar. And what we do in this class is not so much looking how it's similar, we look how it's different. So it might copy the same story from Babylon and change a few things. And those few things are the parts that stand out and make a big difference. We're going to see some of those today in Leviticus, or at least I'm going to talk about them. I'm keeping this in the PowerPoint just for those that are interested in different sources that make up things. But I do want to look at this. So most of the Torah, or the Pentateuch, those first 5 books of the Bible, they're primarily made up of 2 sources. There is the priestly source, which is red, and then there's these 2, and we call them the non-priestly sources. They were based on oral traditions. And when Israel came back after exile, after Babylon, they had to compile their Bible together. And so the biblical scholars of their day kind of mixed together all these different sources, and that gave us the Bible that we have today. It's interesting sometimes that we can find some of those differences. So generally, we'll talk about Genesis as being a mix of priestly and then those oral traditions that were centered around Abraham. Exodus is a mix of priestly, those oral traditions centered around Moses. And then there's Leviticus that we're going to be in today. Leviticus is just a priestly source for the first half of the book. And then the second half has this block that we call the Holiness Code. Has anyone ever heard that word, the Holiness Code, before? So most scholars, and throughout most of history, the Holiness Code is something that we thought was really, really old. There are some scholars today that think the Holiness Code is actually really, really new. And we'll get to that in a moment. But that's kind of the makeup of the Bible. Oh yeah, do the overview. Okay, so this is how kind of these books flow together. Because to me, it's really helpful not to just look at individual books, but know how they flow together. So the story of the Bible begins with God creating the whole world. God creates the Garden of Eden. And the Garden of Eden is like a temple inside the world. It's a place where God dwells. We talk about God walking with Adam and Eve. That's how the story of creation starts. And if you go to Revelation, it's how it ends, when that city is brought back on earth and God's walking with people again. And so the whole story of the Bible, it really has to do with temple, with God dwelling with people. Something happens in Genesis 3, there's the great fall, and things fall apart. And there's this struggle back and forth through all these different incidences throughout the book of Genesis of people trying to get it right, and they always mess up. And so Genesis 12, God comes down, he picks Abraham, And he says, I will make a nation out of you, and you will bless the whole world. And the rest of Genesis kind of follows that story with Abraham about making this nation. If you're like in a theater cut scene, new scene, the book of Exodus opens up and the nation is here now. But they're in exile, they're in Egypt. And they're not supposed to be in Egypt, they're supposed to be in that promised land. And that's how the story of Exodus starts out. This new nation, this people leave Egypt. They end up at Mount Sinai, and that's where we spent the last couple of months building a tabernacle. And we built the tabernacle like 3 times. A tabernacle and a temple are the same thing. It's a place where God dwells. And so that's kind of what Exodus was about. But then it ended with Moses. So this was last week. Moses couldn't go in the tabernacle once it was built. And so it seems kind of strange in the narrative. Why did we build this tabernacle if we can't go in it? And the reason is because God is holy and we aren't. So we can't go in the presence of God. And so Leviticus, that we're going to read today, it answers the problem, how do we get inside the temple? And what's really great, the way that Leviticus starts is God calls out to Moses in the tabernacle, or from the tabernacle. So God's inside the tabernacle calling out to Moses, and then he repeats the whole book of Leviticus, and then Moses writes it down. That's kind of how the story goes. Numbers starts, God calls to Moses in the tabernacle, not from it, but they're both in it together, which is really, really cool. So Exodus ends, Moses, I think I actually, did I put this on a slide? Oh, I do in a couple slides. We'll go ahead and skip there. Oh my gosh, where did I put it? Oh, here it is. Okay, so in Exodus, they build the tabernacle. Moses can't enter it. Leviticus, it's about restoring right worship. God's calling to Moses from the tabernacle. Numbers, they're both in it together. And Numbers is then about getting to the promised land, which is where we're going to move to next week. We're going to go through our journey through the desert, and we're going to end up in the promised land. Deuteronomy is a repeat of all those books from a different source. Is that cool? Kind of that like meta narrative? I think it makes Leviticus a lot more personal. It's not just like all these random laws and rules. It's about how do I get to God? And this is for the people of Israel, how you get to God, which is really cool. Let me go back because I got out there. So this was our overview of Exodus that we looked at last week. We finished that video. Today, though, we're going to be in Leviticus. And so I'm going to pass this around as well, and keep one for myself. Did anyone read any of Leviticus? What parts did you read?
Chapter you said 16.
Chapter 16. Did anyone read any extra parts than 16?
I read 17.
Oh, 17. Okay, Janie, what did you read?
I read it all.
Oh my gosh. Okay, tell us your new insights. How do you feel?
It was painful, very painful.
So, I think I had said this before, but when I was getting my degree in biblical studies, I had a professor, and he used to spend one day on Leviticus, kind of like we're going to do in here. But then he realized that he should probably spend more time on Leviticus instead of skipping through it. So he started a whole month, and he would tell us, you're going to hate me when we walk through it, but by the end, you're going to love Leviticus. And by golly, by the end, I actually really loved Leviticus. And a lot of it for me was looking at the sacrifices, which is why I asked that y'all brought in food. Also to tempt you to still come today. So this is Leviticus. We will move through this chart. You can begin looking at it. The way that it's organized is that there's 3 sections in the middle, and these sections correspond to each other. I'm going to stop touching this TV. I'm going to make someone mad. This was our outline that we looked at in Leviticus. I put it back in this presentation because I want to remember this phrase. It's Exodus. I am the Lord your God, or I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of Egypt. That was our phrase that kept getting repeated throughout the book of Exodus. That name is going to change, or that phrase is going to change in Leviticus. So now we're in Leviticus, and it's be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy, or I, Yahweh your God, am holy. this is what I want us to remember from Leviticus. Be holy, for I, Yahweh your God, am holy. A little bit of an overview of the book. So its name in Hebrew is Wakira, and it's Hebrew for "and he called." We get the name Leviticus. It's translated through Greek, and it just means of the priest, essentially, from the tribe of Levi. But that original name in Hebrew, "and he called," and it's when God's calling out to Moses from the tabernacle. Knowing the Hebrew names, I think, adds kind of another layer of meaning to the books. So the author for this, so like traditionally, like Moses, like wrote this down. So God calls out to Moses from the tent, and Moses writes all this down. Scholarship today would say it's primarily from that priestly source, and there's that addition of the holiness code that we'll talk about more in a second. Leviticus is a book that they kind of think is written, at least completed later, so like later than Exodus and later than Numbers even. And so like for me, I think the holiness code is the older part, but some scholars think it's the newest part. And it was written in exile or even after the exile when Israel is back in Israel. So after they've been in Babylon and they're rebuilding the temple. And so a lot of this is built to both learn how to have the temple and how to be holy without a temple. And so in the second half of the book, there's a lot of rules for individuals as people to live a holy life, even without being in the temple. Some of the themes in it, so holiness, you're going to hear that word a lot. There's sacrifice, ritual purity, and then there's how to worship in the tabernacle or in the temple. And we're going to get this idea, the same that we saw in Exodus, that worshiping correctly in the temple is very important. Aaron has 4 sons. 2 of them use the wrong incense blend and they're struck dead. Which you're like, whoa, that sounds really crazy. But the using a different incense blend, it's like you're worshiping a different God. And so this is dictating how we worship Yahweh. And as a community, so they're a covenant family, they all need to do it in the same way. And so that's important. And you really see that with Aaron's sons being killed. And kind of what I wrote for this, so it's written for Jews that are returning to temple worship, but it's also written for everyone for how to be holy before God. Any questions about this kind of overview? Anybody want to try and say the Hebrew name? Sometimes that's spelled with a V, a V-A-K, Vakira. I think we already looked at that. Okay, so here we are on our map. We started up here. That's how Exodus began. We've wandered our way down to Mount Sinai. In the timeline of the narrative, 1 year ago was when they left Egypt. And the book of Leviticus at Mount Sinai is going to happen for about a month. And then next month, we're going to go into Numbers. And that's going to start the rest of the journey that we're going to work our way back up to the Promised Land and make a couple stops along the way. Oh, great. Okay. So this is our outline. Is there an extra one of those papers? The single sheet. That's the outline. Did I make it up?
Here, just take this
Is that okay?
We can share. No,
It doesn't want me.
it doesn't.
Okay.
I said it squished it.
So this is my outline of Leviticus. I put a shortened one up here, but if you are weird and you just you can fold this up and put it in your Bible in Leviticus, and you can pull it out and be like, oh, I know what happens in those chapters. That's kind of the idea with this little outline. And so the book of Leviticus, we can roughly break it up into 2 different sections. So there's that priestly code, and then there's that holiness code. Do I have on the next? Oh yeah, okay, all right. So the first 7 chapters is the part that's going to go over all the different sacrificial laws. And that's going to include 5 different types of offerings. We are going to look at those 5 different types of offerings. Again, one of the reasons we brought in all the food, because some of those are going to correspond to them. The next part that it's going to cover is the priestly ordination and services. So that's chapters 8 through 10. And then we're going to get purity laws. So we have the sacrifices, priest, purity laws. And then the middle of the book is chapter 16 and chapter 17. And that's the middle book, it's the focus. We'll look on it in just a slide in a second. The rest of the book of Leviticus is what we call the Holiness Code. Roughly, we could think about the Holiness Code as being a piece of, it's just a laying out of all these different laws for the people of Israel as individuals. And one of the cool things about the Holiness Code is we can track its essentially progression from Samaria down through Mesopotamia and into Canaan. And we can see, like, line by line, this is one of the things I referenced last week that Adam Bean did. He would look at some of the verses line by line, and we can watch where it started in Babylon and as it grows bigger, as it ends up in this Holiness Code that we have in Leviticus. What's cool about that is that our Holiness Code in Leviticus gives more and more room for widows, for orphans, for aliens that are in the land. And so a lot of these types of laws, particularly chapters 8 through 20, are dealing with those kind of ethical practices that you're going to have. And that's kind of the section that we get that's been kind of flowing around and through. The other part that's really cool, and this is special to me and why I like to divide Leviticus into these two different sections. The priestly code gives the perspective that for Israel to be holy, there are a select class of people, so the priest, and they go through different rituals that make the priest holy. And so the priests are standing out of the people and for the people, but holiness only has to do with the priest. And that's kind of what's presented throughout the first half of the book. And that same perspective is in the other parts of the Bible that have the priestly source. The Holiness Code gives a different idea. And it's not that the priests are the ones that are holy, it's that all of Israel, all of the people are holy. And so it gives this idea that everyone is involved and everyone is responsible to be holy. And it lays out what all of us can do to kind of be holy before God. It makes it really special. The second part of Leviticus gets really personal, as it were. So it's not all about the priest, it's all about the people. Does that make sense? Okay. It goes through all these different sections, and then at the end, chapter 26, it's kind of like a conclusion. So it's the blessings and the curses. So it lays out, if you do these things, I will bless you like this. If you don't do these things, I will curse you. And if they keep breaking this covenant with God, eventually they're going to get kicked out of the land, out of the promised land that they're about to go into. And then chapter 27 is like an epilogue or a finale that's kind of tacked on at the end. I'm going to read this. This is from Christine Hayes, and this is what she says about the difference in the priestly and the holiness. This theme in the exhortation, "You shall be holy, for I, Yahweh your God, am holy," they find their fullest expression in the block of text. Leviticus 17 through 26, that's referred to as the Holiness Code. There's an important difference between the first 16 chapters and the last section, the Holiness Code. According to Leviticus 1 through 16, Israel's priests are designated as holy, a holy class within Israel, singled out, dedicated to the service of God, and ruled by rules that apply only to them. Israelites may aspire to holiness, but it's not assumed. However, in the Holiness Code, we have texts that come closer to the idea that Israel itself is holy by virtue of the fact that God has set Israel apart from the nations to himself, to belong to him, just as he set apart the seventh day to himself, to belong with him. I really like the second half of Leviticus because it gets into how do we as people be holy. And if you like that idea that like you too can be holy, you'd probably really like the book of Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy, the Holiness Code is very close to the Deuteronomist kind of perspective, which is that people can be holy and people should be holy, and that's how individual Israelites can kind of live out a holy life. Make sense? Questions about that? Insights? Funny thoughts? Okay. That is this outline of looking at the book kind of cut in half. That is what most of this sheet is. But there's another outline that's really helpful for looking at it as well. Does everybody remember the word chiasm? What is a chiasm?
Pyramid?
A pyramid, yeah. So for a lot of the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew poetry, when you can't bold or highlight or underline, the way that they will draw, I'm looking at you all since y'all have been here through all of this. A lot of the way you draw attention is through a structure called a chiasm. And so the text is written like a pyramid. So it'll be A, B, C, B, A. And the focus point is the middle. And so you might repeat things like, my favorite color is blue. I have a dog named Mordecai. I love all dogs. I also have a dog named Sully. I also like the color red. So like, I talked about my favorite colors, I talked about my dog's name, and the middle is, I really love dogs. And that's the part that you're supposed to get about me. And so maybe you also learned, I bought a red and a blue collar. I'm making this up. This is not. I do have a dog named Mordecai and Sully. So the book of Leviticus is one big chiastic structure. I have this kind of played out down here after the line. That's supposed to be like a dividing line to show it's a new outline. So the first 7 chapters go through holy practices. It's all P's, by the way, if you didn't notice. And then you get to the holy priesthood, holy people, the Day of Atonement, so 16 and part of 17, that's the focal point. And then there's, again, holy people, the holy priesthood, and then again, holy practices. And then you have that ending clocked on with chapters 26, 27, the epilogue and the blessings and the curses. So this is one way of looking at it, and we're going to look at some more detailed examples of that chiasm. So here's a really cool chart that's a pyramid. And so it begins, so we're talking about ritual. So those first 7 chapters are going to talk about ritual sacrifice. There's the 2 types of offerings or sacrifices there's 5 types of sacrifices or offerings that they're going to make. The next part, it's all about the priest. It's about the priest getting ordained. Aaron and his sons are the ones that are going to be this eternal priesthood essentially throughout Israel's history. Then there's about ritual purity. So when people tend to think about Leviticus, they probably think about this section. It's all the different rituals that they do and the things that make them clean or unclean. So this is less about being sinful or bad. It's about ritual cleanliness. So if you touched a dead body, it's not bad, but you become ritually unclean, and then you couldn't enter the temple. And there's a process that you have to go through to be clean again. And that leads up then to this Day of Atonement, that middle section, which is the ceremony with the 2 goats and the scapegoat. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Here's another way of laying that out. So this is from some monastery, but they stole this picture from the Bible Project. This is a screenshot of the video that I sent out on Thursday, which was interesting. I also stole it from them. So, here it is, chapters 1 through 7, 23 through 25 or 27 is about ritual. I keep touching the screen. I need to stop that. So these next 2 parts, they're about the priesthood. 11 through 15, 18 through 20 are about purity, so that cleanliness and the ritual. And then 16, in the first part of 17, there are about that Day of Atonement, the 2 goats, the scapegoat ceremony. Okay, any questions about this as a structure? Oh, great, okay. Is this completely boring, or is this kind of cool? Oh, okay, all right. By the way, I was going to pick out some specific verses that we could look at, and then I decided to not do that. Especially because no one sent in questions over any hot topics in Leviticus. But we are welcome to, if anyone has questions about a verse, to just pull it out and we can read it and talk about it. So I was just thinking about, like, what are some common questions? And this is topics I wanted to include, and I couldn't figure out how to get it in my outline, so I just stuck them right here. So I just made up that someone's going to ask this question. Well, is Leviticus all about works righteousness? No, so we, like Bible scholars, will talk about this word, covenantal nomism. Don't y'all think about that every Monday morning? So, covenantal nomism. Nomism comes from this Greek word that means law. And so this is that Israel, like the Jewish religious system, it's not based on works righteousness. Works righteousness is this idea that if I do good works or if I do bad works, I can lay them out on a scale. And if my good works outweigh my bad works, then I've earned God's favor. And that's not at all what the Jewish system is about. It's about living according to this covenantal law, essentially. And so it's about relationship. The covenant that God has with Israel and the laws that follow through it, it's the rules for a relationship together, this covenant relationship. And so all of the things that are laid out in all of the law, it's not about earning God's favor, it's just defining the relationship. And so this is how the people are going to live according to this covenant relationship. One way that we could think about it for us as Christians is we don't have a covenant based on circumcision and all that follows. We have a covenant based on baptism, and we have Eucharist. And there's other things that we do as Christians, but think about it like this. Like, it would be weird for a Christian to not have baptism and Eucharist. Like, those are the two, as Episcopalians, for us at least, those are the two things we kind of identify as our Christian rituals, the things that we do. And so you could kind of think about it like that, living according to that covenant, this law. It's like us with baptism and with Eucharist. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Woohoo. Does this apply to me as a Christian? So when I grew up Baptist, and so I have a tattoo on my arm, and it's really funny. When I first got my tattoo, my dad really freaked out, and he was telling me about Leviticus, and in the same 2 verses later, there's a passage about not eating shellfish or not interweaving the material in your clothes. It was all supposed to be one material, and that was a question that was important to me as a young person. Does this apply to me as a Christian? So if you were to live according to Leviticus, you could do that if you wanted. I don't know how you would practically do that in today's world, but you could try. But I don't think it's a book that's worth throwing out, particularly in this phrase about be holy for I am holy. So all of these laws given here are about making a new people, making a people that kind of stand out from the rest of the world. And I think that's an idea that we can take with us as Christians for kind of how do we live in God's world? Well, we can live a holy life. And that might mean different things for us. It's going to mean different things in different cultures. But it's a good question to ask. Does my lifestyle look different than someone that's not living a holy life or living in God's good world? It's a good question to ask. I think it's a good ethic to take with you as you read Leviticus. And I'll give an example of that. So one of the questions, I think it's Leviticus 18, they're not allowed to eat shellfish and they're not allowed to mix fabrics. Also, the men are not allowed to trim the edges of their beard. And there's other things like that. And so you're like, they couldn't eat lobster? I mean, that's kind of funny. So different cultures have different foods that we kind of prioritize as being good foods and being bad foods. One of the funny ones is shellfish and insects. So what would you rather eat? A cricket or some crab? Or shrimp? Yeah, let's use shrimp. A cricket or shrimp? Which would you rather eat? Yeah, you would probably rather eat shrimp. Interestingly enough, though, that narrative of what we prioritize is flipped from the ancient world. So in the ancient world, lobster, crab, and shrimp are disgusting because they're filter feeders. They're gross. But their priorities were actually, the crickets and eating these insects, were more of the delicacy, roughly. Even 50 years ago, lobster was not considered a delicacy before we had wide refrigeration everywhere. Lobster was a poor person's food. And you would eat gross canned lobster because you couldn't freeze it and ship it inland and things like that. So why no shellfish? Because for that culture, it was the bad foods. It's a filter feeder. It's gross. It's like you eating a cockroach. Before you have a lot of the food practices that we have today, that's one of those foods that probably wouldn't be the best to eat. No mixing fabrics, that's another one. So some people like to look at the laws in Leviticus and give a reason, like I just did for the shrimp. But sometimes there's not a reason for these laws. So in this example of mixing fabrics, better clothes are the result of mixing fabrics. And so, like, I understand why they would not eat shellfish or not eat pork if you don't have refrigeration and good sanitary practices. Why wouldn't you mix your fabrics?
I would think it would be because it'd be more expensive. You know, I'm thinking of like many colored coats that Dolly Parton sings about. That would be, you know, poor people would just patch together whatever they could.
Oh,
And in
that is-
that case, you know, not mixing fabrics, I think is more expensive than I think of the,
I like that as an idea. That's different than where I was going to go.
yeah.
Does anyone ever have, like, why would you not mix fabrics?
Is there an answer, or are we just,
Yeah, no, I have an answer.
you have, I don't mean to be, I'm
So-
curious, are we?
So this is one of those ones
Yeah, I mean, it's just as good,
that
your
might
guess is as good as.
that might be symbolic. In the same way you don't mix fabrics, don't mix your cultures. And so there's a lot of other laws that are symbolic. So don't mix lamb's wool and goat wool is the way of saying don't mix with the Canaanites. And so a lot of these other laws, like, they might not serve good practical purposes, but they also have symbolic reason that's very meaningful. And so that's an example, like, if I was to try to live according to an ethic of Leviticus, I could think, okay, what food might be healthier for me? So, like, maybe I'm not going to go and eat poisoned food or something like that. Or I might take that ethic of not mixing fabrics as a way of, like, how do I live like a more holy life that I physically stand out to those around me. That's the same idea of why they have dictated their haircuts and things like that. It's so that they looked different. They looked like a different people than the Canaanites. It was a way of making them stand out. Make sense? Okay. Why should I read Leviticus? I tried to come up with a good answer, and then I changed my answer. And so I just went, well, you don't have to. At first I thought we might try and take a few weeks of reading Leviticus, and then I decided not to. But this Day of Atonement, this ritual, is really important. Is anybody familiar with Yom Kippur? Okay, so Yom Kippur, it's the Day of Atonement. It's connected with that chapter 16. Let me check the time. Oh, great, okay. And so the ritual that they would do is once a year they would take 2 goats, and so only once a year is when this would happen. And so the high priest, at this point there's not a high priest, but we'll fill in. So the high priest is going to take one of those goats and sacrifice it, and they take the blood of that goat and they sprinkle it on the scapegoat. And they would sprinkle it then on the mercy seat. Remember we talked about that inside the tabernacle on the Ark of the Covenant. And that other goat, they would let it free. That's actually funny. The Hebrew word that we translate as scapegoat is they release it to this, and there's like this word that we don't know how to translate because it only pops up once. If you want to go on a tangent, you could look up that word. But the King James is the scapegoat. And that becomes a picture for New Testament writers about Jesus. Is that Jesus is like that goat that is sacrificed, and then that blood of the sacrifice is then covered onto us. Right after this, chapter 17, at least the first part of chapter 17, talks about the sanctity of blood. For the Israelites and in the ancient world, blood represents the life force. And so if you miss blood, you're missing life.
Wouldn't that temple stink?
Our phones are working again. I got a text. What?
Wouldn't that temple stink?
Yeah, it would. You know.
Did you ever clean it? I mean, I would think it'd be repulsive.
When I was younger, we had ducks and we had meat rabbits, and so one of my weekend jobs once a month was to process the next batch of rabbits, and it stunk, especially if it was in the summer and it was hot outside. And so, like, when you go to church, you're wearing perfume, you smell really nice. It's a good experience, especially if there's great incense. When you go to the temple, it's not like that. It's very visceral. There's blood everywhere. Remember we talked about how all the different metals, there was that harsh bronze that it's being scraped every single day, so it doesn't even really look that pretty. There's going to be blood everywhere, carcasses everywhere. It's a very different experience. But it becomes this picture that could have been me. But God has given a way for it to not be me. And so, yeah, it's a very different feeling than when we think about going to church. questions about that scapegoat, I have a 3-minute video about Yom Kippur that I think is also kind of relevant to Lent. Does anyone want to watch it?
Sure.
I also included this kid. Oh, did I take it out? Oh, that's weird. I didn't think I took it out. Okay. We might have another video pop up, but I'm not going to play it. I'm just going to, I kept it in here so I could send it out. Well, I don't hear that.
In big cities,
Oh. I'm going to make the sound pop through that TV.
Magic.
Yeah, if I could just see it, that would be helpful.
Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year for the Jewish people. This is the time of year when most Jews show up for services, or at least more than usual. In big cities, you sometimes even need tickets. The place gets pretty crowded. To prepare, during the days before the holiday, people make amends and ask forgiveness from their family and friends, and then the day arrives. We learn, on this day you are to afflict your soul, and Yom Kippur makes atonement for you and all Jewish people. So, how do you afflict your soul? Famously by fasting from food and drink. There are other prohibitions too. No bathing, perfume, sex, or wearing leather. It's a lot of stuff you can't do. Fasting and praying, though, are not enough, as Yom Kippur demands that Jews also commit to changing their behavior. As it says in the Haftarah reading from the prophet Isaiah, an empty fast is not sufficient. This is the fast I desire, to share your bread with the hungry, to take care of the poor, to clothe the naked, and to not ignore our fellows. Traditionally, you spend the entire evening and next day at prayer services. There's many ways that people actually do this holiday. Some people create their own rituals, taking a contemplative walk, or fasting at home. Yom Kippur begins with a service just before sunset called Kol Nidre. You'll notice it's the one time a year where people wear a prayer shawl or talit at night, and many are dressed in white. Kol Nidre is a public apology in advance for failing to meet our own vows and admitting we're not perfect. The chanting of this stirring melody is the beginning of a marathon that ends 25 hours later. The evening, morning, and afternoon services that follow each contain special passages. Importantly, people chant confessions, called vidui, silently as well as out loud. Readers chant from Leviticus about the scapegoat ceremony that atoned for people's misdeeds, as well as the book of Jonah, about the prophet who ran away from God and eventually changed his ways. There's a memorial service called Yizkor. Yom Kippur is a time for relationship maintenance, requiring Jews to seek out reconciliation with others, with themselves, and with God. The imagery of the holiday is of gates, the gates of prayer, of soul searching, and of forgiveness, which are closed at the final service, Ne'ilah, or locking of the gates. There's another metaphor, being written in the book of life on Rosh Hashanah and now being sealed in the very same book on Yom Kippur. You might hear people say, Gemar Chatima Tova, may you be sealed for a good new year. As Ne'ilah concludes, the shofar is sounded in a dramatic closing ceremony. With the final blast, the ups and downs of a really long day come to a full stop. It's chow time. Time to eat as Jews gather together for break the fast. Not breakfast, because it's at night. Like any good cleanse, Yom Kippur leaves you feeling wrung out like a sponge, having gone along a spiritual journey, refreshed and renewed, ready to begin again with a clean slate. Gemar Chatima Tova.
That made me kind of think about some of our Lenten practices, so I wanted to play that right now. So that's Yom Kippur. It's roughly based on that scapegoat ceremony, is kind of the idea behind it. It happens in September or October. But back to Leviticus. So Leviticus starts in the first 7 chapters with these different sacrifices. So I put a cool little graphic down here. You're welcome to look at this that has the different 5 sacrifices or offerings that they go through. Not all of the offerings are a sacrifice. And so But the first one is. So the first one that they do is called the burnt offering. And so this is the one that everyone is supposed to do to make atonement for their sins. And you are supposed to do it with a bull, if you have one. But if you're poor and you don't have a bull, because bulls are expensive, you can do it with a bird, like a chicken or something like that. So the next type of offering is a grain or a meal offering. And so, this is why I asked someone to bring a chicken. And then I thought about bringing chicken, and y'all were like, brought lots of food. I kept getting every day more and more emails, and I was like, we don't need any more extra food. So the next one is that grain offering. This is why I asked if someone could bring in bread. I thought that would be a good picture. But the grain offering was not just bread. It was simple and ground up grain, which has anyone ever tried to like mill their own grain before? It's a process that takes a lot of time. And so I want to point that out because today you can go to the store and buy flour. I am allergic to gluten, and so I have to have rice flour. When I was younger, gluten-free flour was super expensive, so we would make our own. And I tried the first time by putting rice in my blender, and that did not work. So then I got a pestle and mortar and sat there, and I did it for about 10 minutes, and I gave up. But I made bread out of it one time, and it was hard and crunchy and really gross. For this offering, it was with fine flour, which I bring up to point out that it's something that took a lot of time to do, and you're kind of wasting it, as it were. But they would take that flour and they would pour oil on it and put frankincense in it. So it would probably smell really nice, as it was like a mixture of baked bread and frankincense, which is what the incense that we use like on Christmas and stuff is primarily frankincense. And this offering was voluntary, and it was a way of thanking God. And so some people will call this the love offering. And it was just like maybe you got married and you wanted to thank God or celebrate that. Maybe you had a birth of a new child, you wanted to celebrate that sort of thing. That's what this kind of offering, and anyone could do this. The next one is a fellowship or a peace offering. So this one is, yet again, you could use a bull. If you don't have a bull, you could use, I need to stop touching this. You could use the chicken or another bird like a pigeon or something. And if you don't have that, you could also use grain. There was the purification or the sin offering. And so this one, you would use a bull or wheat. And then the last one is the guilt offering. So this one's interesting, and I have a slide. We'll look at these in some more detail in a second. But this one you have to use a ram, and there's a restitution that has to happen after that. So we're just going to look at these really quickly. So the burnt offering, if you want to go back and look at these and look at their corresponding passages, you can when I send this out, because you're just really interested in offerings. But this one was going to be burnt completely, hence the name, the burnt offering. So nothing was saved from this. It would all be cooked up, which would take a long time. And so it was a voluntary act of worship, atonement. So if you had like done some kind of grievous sin, you might do this. And it was also a way of committing yourself to God. And again, you could use a bull, but if you can't afford a bull, you could use a dove or a pigeon or a chicken. The grain offering, that's that one that was the mix of flour and olive oil and frankincense. And it was a way of thanking God. The other one, so that peace offering, this was yet another thing. It was an act of thanksgiving, or if you're going to fulfill a vow. And so maybe you're about to make some kind of big life commitment, you would do this peace offering, and you're supposed to use an animal. And this one is different because the leftovers from this are given to the priest. And so this would go and feed the priest. Then there is the sin offering. So this is if you have sinned. And this is, well, I've got to read this one because I can't remember. You could use different types of animals. If you couldn't, you could use flour. I can't remember if this one goes to the priest or not afterwards. I'm not sure. But the last one, I really like this, is the guilt offering. So if you did something really, really bad, you would do the guilt offering. And it's kind of an expensive offering. So the three examples that I give for this, so if you have any unintentional sins that you around sacred items. So for instance, like the example I gave is like maybe you accidentally broke a piece of the altar, or maybe your ox ate the grass on this sacred plot of land or something like that. You would have to do this offering. It's also if you had a breach of trust. So if I had gone into a commitment with John and then I broke that commitment, like I broke our contract, I would have to do this. If you robbed someone, and it's also for if I made false witness against someone as well. And for this offering, you would not only do the offering, you would also have to pay back some of the value of what you broke. And so it was a way of making restitution for that. So that's that one that's with the ram. And so I think these are really cool. And one of the things that you might notice, most of these are voluntary acts. So if you did something wrong, you have to sacrifice a ram. But the other ones are voluntary for you to do, which blew my mind when I first learned that. Because I always thought about these sacrifices as this requirement for individuals that they had to do. So there were sacrifices done every day at the tabernacle, at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day. They would sacrifice 2 goats. And then once a year, they let one of those goats go. But all of these are voluntary acts. If you love God, if you have some kind of new life kind of thing. When we started way back in Genesis with the story of Abraham, we talked about how they cut all these different animals in half. They laid them on either side. And it was a way of kind of commemorating this new movement, this new covenant, this new commitment. And you do that because animals are expensive. And so it's a way of marking importance. Just like we do with wedding ceremonies. Like, you can be married without a ceremony, but we have a ceremony because it marks the importance of it. And so we spend money on it because it's important. And that's the same idea behind here. It's really cool. And I hope it kind of changes the way that you think about all of these different sacrifices, not as requirements, but as options for people to, I don't know why this is in here twice, options for people to celebrate God. Oh, there's that other video. We're not going to watch this. Okay, here's the outline of the book of Leviticus. In a moment, I'm going to play this video, but only for those that want to watch it. I do want to just say next week, we're going to be looking at the book of Numbers. We're going to do an overview of the book of Numbers, similar to this, minus the food, and hopefully a working camera when we do that. So next week, February 29th, we're going to do an overview of the book of Numbers. For those that are newer into here, the way that I like to break up our reading is to follow the Jewish lectionary of reading. And so March 7th, we're going to look at Numbers 1 through 4. I will send out the specific verse numbers like after next week. On March 14th, so this is spring break. I don't know if people will be gone, but we're going to not do Numbers, and we're going to do a special episode or whatever on the tribes of Israel. That's going to follow some modern scholarship. So if you ever had the question like, how did we get all these tribes? Were all those tribes real? And questions like that, and how scholars would answer that. We're going to look at that. We're going to play a video, 2 videos, and then we're going to talk about them. March 21st, we'll look at Numbers 4 through 7. March 28th is Holy Week. And so to be determined if we will meet that week, when we get closer to it, we'll visit that. And April 4th, the church is closed. So we will not meet because we're not allowed to. Okay, any questions about upcoming stuff? Okay, I'm going to play this video. This is the one that I have not sent out. It is an overview of this. You are welcome to skedaddle if you don't care. After this video, I will replay that other one.
Thanks, Allison.
Thank you.
The book of Leviticus. It's the 3rd book of the Bible, and it's set right after the exodus of the Israelites from their slavery, when God brought them to the foot of Mount Sinai and invited Israel into a covenant relationship. Now, they had quickly rebelled and broke that covenant, and God wanted for his glorious presence to come and live right in the midst of Israel in the form of this tabernacle. But Israel's sin has damaged the relationship. So, at the end of the previous book, Exodus, Moses, as Israel's representative, could not even enter God's presence in the tent. The book of Leviticus opens by reminding us of this fundamental problem. It says, "The Lord called to Moses from So the question is, how can Israel, in their sin and selfishness, be reconciled to this holy God? That's what this book is all about. How God is graciously providing a way for sinful, corrupt people to live in his holy presence. Now, let's pause for a second and explore this really important idea that God is holy. It's fundamental to understanding this book. The word holy means simply to be set apart or unique. And in the Bible, God is set apart from all other things because of his unique role as the creator of all, as the author of life itself. And so if God is holy, then the space around God is also holy. It's full of his goodness and his life and purity and justice. So if Israel, who is unjust and sinful, wants to live in God's holy presence, they too need to become holy. Their sin has to be dealt with. Thus, the book of Leviticus. Now, the book has a really amazing symmetrical design. It explores the three main ways that God helps Israel to live in his presence. The outer sections are descriptions of the rituals Israel was to practice in God's holy presence. The next inner sections focus on the role of Israel's priests as mediators between God and Israel. And inside of that are two matching sections that focus on Israel's purity. And then right here at the center of the book, there's a key ritual, the Day of Atonement, that brings the whole book together. The book concludes with a short section where Moses calls on Israel to be faithful to this covenant. Let's dive into the book. The first section explores the 5 main types of ritual sacrifices that Israel was to perform. 2 of these were ways that an Israelite could say thank you to God by offering back to God these symbolic tokens of what God has first given them. 3 other sacrifices were different ways of saying sorry to God. So here an Israelite would offer up the lifeblood of an animal while confessing that their sin has created more evil and death in God's good world. But instead of destroying this person, God, of course, wants to forgive them. And so this animal symbolically dies in their place and atones, which means it covers for their sin. And so through these rituals, the Israelites were constantly being reminded of God's grace, but also of his justice and of the seriousness of their evil and its consequences. The second set of rituals lays out the 7 annual feasts of Israel. And each of these retold a different part of the story about how God redeemed them from slavery in Egypt and brought them through the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land. And by celebrating these feasts regularly, Israel would remember who they were and who God was to them. Now, the sections about Israel's priests, you have Aaron and his sons first ordained to enter into God's presence on behalf of Israel. And then in this matching section, we find the qualifications for being a priest. The priests were called to the highest level of moral integrity and ritual holiness because they represented the people before God, but then also represented God to the people. Now, we find out why the priest's holiness matters so much back here in this first section. Right after the family of Aaron was ordained, 2 of his sons waltz right into God's presence and flagrantly violate the rules. And so they are consumed by God's holiness on the spot. It's a haunting reminder of the paradox of living in God's holy presence, because it's pure goodness, but it becomes dangerous to those who rebel and insult God's holiness. And so it's important that Israel's priests become holy, and also that all of the people of Israel become holy, which is what the next inner sections are all about. Chapters 11 through 15 are about the ritual purity required of all the Israelites, and chapters 18 through 20 are about the moral purity of the people. Here's what's underneath all of this purity and impurity language. Because God is holy and he's set apart, the Israelites need to be in a state of holiness themselves when they enter into his presence. This was called being clean or pure. God's presence was off limits to anybody who was not in a holy state, and this was called being unclean or impure. Now, an Israelite could become impure in just a few ways: by contact with reproductive body fluids, by having a skin disease, by touching mold or fungus, or by touching a dead body. Now, for the Israelites, all of these were associated with mortality, with the loss of life, which gets us to the core symbol of all these ideas. You become impure when you're contaminated by touching death, so to speak. And death is the opposite of God's holiness, because God's essence is life. Now, this is really key. Simply being impure was not sinful or wrong. Touching these kinds of things was a normal part of everyday life. And impurity was a temporary state. It just lasted a week or 2, and then it's over. What was wrong or sinful was to waltz into God's presence carrying these symbols of death and impurity on my body. Don't do that. Now, the last way of becoming impure was by eating certain animals. And the kosher food laws are found right here in this section. Now, there have been lots of theories about why certain animals were considered impure and off limits. To promote hygiene or to avoid cultural taboos, the text just isn't explicit. But the basic point of all of these chapters is really clear. Altogether, these work as an elaborate set of cultural symbols that reminds Israel that God's holiness was to affect all areas of their lives. This corresponding section over here is about Israel's moral purity. The Israelites were called to live differently than the Canaanites. They were to care for the poor instead of overlooking them. They were to have a high level of sexual integrity, and they were to promote justice throughout their entire land. Now, here at the center of the book, we find a long description of one of Israel's annual feasts, the Day of Atonement. Odds are that not every Israelite's sin and rebellion would be covered through the individual sacrifices. And so once a year, the high priest would take 2 goats. One of these would become a purification offering and atone for the sins of the people. And the other was called the scapegoat. The priest would confess the sins of Israel and symbolically place them on this goat, and then it would be cast out into the wilderness. Again, this is a very powerful image of God's desire to remove sin and its consequences from his people so that God can live with them in peace. The book concludes with Moses calling Israel to be faithful to all of the terms of the covenant. And he describes the blessings of peace and abundance that will result if Israel obeys all of these laws. He also warns them that if they're unfaithful and dishonor God's holiness, it will result in disaster and ultimately exile from the land promised to Abraham. Now, if you want to see how Leviticus fits into the big storyline, it's helpful to look at the first sentence of the next book of the Bible, Numbers. It begins, "The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent." So we can see that Moses is now able to enter God's presence on behalf of Israel. The book of Leviticus, it worked. So despite Israel's failure, God has provided a way for their sin to be covered so that God can live with sinful people in peace. And that's what the book of Leviticus is all about.
Yes.
How do you feel about Leviticus now?
Makes so much more sense.
It does, and I really, for me, it's really helpful to remember kind of the arc of each book. So the whole Bible is all about God getting to be with people. We see a glimpse of it in Genesis. It's a picture. This is what it could be like. And it's all about us getting there. God reaches to Abraham, makes a new people. They end up in Egypt. God rescues them from Egypt. They finally build a tabernacle, but they mess that up. So they build the tabernacle, and now it's how do we get in the tabernacle? And what we're going to find through the book of Numbers is we have a tabernacle, but we want to get to that promised land. And that's where we're going to be next week, getting to that promised land. How do we get there? And so I'm excited as we're going to be looking through Numbers.
What was it that Moses did that
So-
put him outside of it?
Well, so 2 things. So the first thing, like Moses can't go to the promised land, is when he strikes that rock. So at one point, if you remember our 4 crises that happened, so there's 2 water shortages. One of them God says hit the rock. The other one he says touch it, and Moses hits it again out of anger, splits the rock, and God says you can't go to the promised land. But then the tabernacle part, when he can't go in there, Moses is impure because of the rock incident. But also Moses is acting as a stand-in for all of Israel. And so they have built the tabernacle, but Israel itself is still impure because of the golden calf incident, which is, again, telling us about how we're not a good people. We always go to other gods. And so it's a stand-in for all of Israel not being able to go in the tabernacle yet. And Leviticus is the answer to kind of fix that.
So after that, he could? After
So yes, and Numbers begins, the first line, he's in the tent now. With, because Leviticus it's a shorter book, and there's not action going on. It's not exciting, but it's all like one script. This is everything God has said to, like they just finished the tabernacle last week. Now God speaks out of the tabernacle, and then Moses comes in, and next week God will say the first part in the tabernacle, and then the action starts. as they leave. Any other questions on Leviticus? We have that other video to play, but I want to see if anyone has like cool questions because I came ready. I deleted all these extra slides. That would be boring, but I've got them all in here, and they'll be here for like 2 more weeks. So.
So we'll be off 2 weeks, Holy Week and.
Maybe Holy Week. We'll visit it as we get closer to there for what we want to do. I don't want to deter from Holy Week.
The scapegoat reminds me, when he's going into the wilderness, the woods, reminds me of Jesus when he was transported into the wilderness by Satan.
Oh, in the temptation.
So, because scapegoats is being like Jesus, taking our sins.
Yes. There's a funny, the word we translate as scapegoat in the KJV. If you want to have fun, you can look that up in chapter 16. But other translations have it as a demon, that they send the goat to a demon or they send it to a place. We don't know what the word is that we translate it as. Does anyone want to rewatch or see with fresh eyes the video? It's also about Leviticus from the same one.
Is that the one?
It's the one that I sent out, yeah.
Okay.
Does anyone want to stay and watch this now?
I've watched it twice already.
You have? Okay. Judy, do you want to watch it?
I would.
Okay. I will play this, and for those, oh, should we wait till we get our food so it's not too much? Thank you everyone for bringing food, by the way. Those are it was, yeah. So the animated overviews, we play them each time. This video is from another series from the same group that is kind of like, why should you read Leviticus, sort of thing. So it goes over the same material, but it's animated in a different way.
Are you gonna pass her? Give her some. Yeah. We'll talk. Good to see you.
Yeah, I got your email.
Yes, I've been getting on.
Oh, okay, cool. I'll wait until next week to see if he wants to come back.
Okay. And your mouth.